Research Seminar Series. I'm Brian Weimer, the Research Compliance Officer here at Tulane University. And we're not using VoxVote today, but Dr. Keating, our presenter, will have some questions, and please participate and answer those questions. And our speaker today is Joseph Keating. He is the undergraduate dean of the Associate Dean of Undergraduate Education at Tulane University School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine. Dr. Keating is a professor in the Department of Tropical Medicine, and he is the vice chair of Tulane University's Institutional Review Board, or IRB. And we are very grateful that Dr. Keating serves that role for the university. So thank you. So, Dr. Keating was a Peace Corps volunteer in Gambia, West Africa, before beginning his teaching career. And here at Tulane, he's received the Outstanding Undergraduate Teacher of the Year Award 3 times. So we have a good presenter for him. His research has focused on malaria in sub-Saharan Africa and malaria epidemiology. And Dr. Keating is going to be talking today about ethical issues in public health research. Reminder, I'll pass the roll sheet at the end of class, so please sign in so you can get your credit for attending. And I'll turn it over now to Dr. Keating. Thank you.
All right, thank you all for coming. May not be the most think about it. You know, ethics is a very tricky subject, but let me preface this conversation with saying a couple things. Number one, I certainly am not going to stand up here and pretend to know all things ethical, et cetera. But we're going to use this platform to sort of walk you through a few different topics that we have to think about. For those that I've worked with before in the room, there's a handful of you. Most of my work, all of my work is international, so this will have sort of international flavor to it. Different settings, different types of research, have different ethical issues to consider. We'll walk through sort of the different factors that we have to consider when we're doing international research. Please feel free to ask questions. For those that have had me in class, I tend to ask you a lot of questions as well, so be prepared to answer. I know a few of your names, so you'll have to keep that in mind if everybody's dead silent. With that, all right, so we're going to start talking about ethical issues in public health research. As Brian mentioned, I'm an epidemiologist, so this is all population-based epidemiology that I do. So this is basically collecting field data, collecting specimens in the field, consenting folks at households, things of that nature. So some of the topics that we're going to cover here, this is by no means exhaustive of the issues you have to consider, but at least these are some of the ones that we consider or often consider and have discussions around. Sort of respect of human subjects, informed consent process, that's a big one. That folks often get bogged down on. Lots of different issues around informed consent, which we'll talk about here. Can you get paid, to be in research? It's another big topic that pops up here. Then we'll take risks and benefits. How do you decide what that risk-benefit ratio looks like? What's a sufficient enough risk-benefit ratio to conduct the study? And then selection of study subjects. You might think this isn't that difficult, right? You heard me say I'm an epidemiologist, so how do epidemiologists usually collect data? Surveys, but like what process would we use to select our subjects?
Randomly.
Yeah, randomly, right? So fair selection of subjects, randomization, right? So how does that play in? But you'd be surprised how tricky that gets when you're doing that at a village level, for example, and one neighbor does not get randomly selected into the study and the other neighbor does, and they want to know why. Why am I not in this particular study? Why am I not receiving that benefit or that intervention or whatever we're doing? And then lastly, we'll talk about sort of scientific and social values of the study. Then hopefully by then you'll have lots of questions and we can open it up and go from there. But to get started, let's just talk a little bit about what prompted these ethical discussions. This is not new to anyone, I'm sure. Lots of events have transpired over the last several hundred years, but most recently we had the Nazi medical war crimes and then the syphilis study at Tuskegee. These are the two studies that are probably the most important in terms of prompting the development of the federal common rule and sort of the guidelines that we follow today. Lots have happened since the 1940s, of course, and we've We've got better methods now. We've got better ways of thinking about things. But these are the two events that actually triggered the way we do scientific research today. So sort of, I don't need to go into great details, right, about what happened in these two events. Everybody familiar with these?
We had a discussion in the first class.
Okay, good. So everybody
There might be
might be what?
some new folks, but
Everybody know what happened at Tuskegee? Anybody got a question about that? Pretty negative operation, right? And of course, we know about the Nazi war crimes that transpired, and as much medical information was gleaned from those atrocities, certainly there's better ways to get that information, right? So anyway, that's what sort of prompted these discussions and policy changes around ethics in research. All right, so here are sort of the three principles to keep in mind when we're actually going through these different topics here. These are the main principles, not all of them necessarily, but what we're going for here is respect for people, right? You got to respect their individuality, you got to respect their rights, you got to respect their welfare, their rights to say no, their right to say yes, their right to say I don't want to be in the study anymore, even though they may have said yes originally. And evidence, and then justice. You're making sure things are fair. So these are sort of the discussions or the topics that we'll talk about with respect to the line items that I mentioned earlier here. All right, so let's get started here. So international settings here. Informed consent process. Let's talk about this one first. So for those that can't read it real quick here, subjects must be informed. They have to understand what's actually taking place. That's true for even clinical trials here, drug studies, vaccine studies. They've got to be informed. They've got to know the risks, the benefits, whether or not they can step out of the study, what will happen to them if they step out of the study. Do they get paid? Do they have to pay to be in the study? Things of this nature. They've got to know, right? It must be given freely based on the participants' understanding. So in other words, it's got to be informed. You've got to make sure that they understand exactly what they're agreeing to do. And then issues around the use of written documentation for consent, signatures, restriction of clinical involvement to the disease under study, and the discussion of legal liability. These are not requirements, right? We often think requirements, but they're not requirements. You do not have to get written consent. What are other ways we can get consent to participate in the study? Verbal consent would be one way to do it. What's another way? I think if you put your international hats on here, maybe you put low to middle income country hats on here. What's another way? Yeah, Brooke.
Like a thumbprint?
All right, thumbprints could work too, right? Yeah, thumbprints certainly could work. Any other ways to do this?
Attendance to a clinical position,
What do you mean by that?
like actively coming in and participating in a study over multiple time points at the same position.
You still have to get consent, though.
Right.
You still have to consent to this. Is there any other way we can do this?
Next.
What's that?
They can do next since they can't like write.
Okay, or a thumbprint or an X if they can't write, in which case, what do you need if you're going to do that? You need a written consent form, but you're going to need a witness too, right? Somebody to attest that that's the person who's actually signing that X, right? So that's if you're using a written document. So you've got verbal consent, you've got thumbprint, you've got the X with a witness, and then you've got somebody reading it to you, right? Somebody reading it to you. So if you think about literacy rates, that's one of our biggest challenges when we're trying to do consent process overseas literacy. So at what level, if we're going to use a written document to get our consent, at what level do we need to have that document written in? Anybody know?
Middle school, I think like sixth grade.
Well, I'm hearing about 10 different answers here that are right for different levels of consent here. Who wants to raise their hand and say the right answer? Eighth grade. Okay, no hand, but we'll take eighth grade. Eighth grade. That's typically the rule. That's not a steadfast rule. We're putting together a study in Ethiopia with one of our colleagues back here in the back right now, and they're accepting ninth grade for consent. Right. So if you go to Word and you go to the options for proofreading, there's a readability scale that you can click, and it'll tell you what's the readability scale of your document. It'll give you a score. It'll give you a value, right? And that's roughly corresponds to the value of the grade that you're shooting for. Now, what about assent? What is assent? Anybody know what that means?
Children.
So that's children. So what age group are we talking about here?
7 to 17. So there's usually like two specifications, 12 to 17 for their developmental level, and then 7 to 11.
Okay, all right, good. Yeah, that's roughly right. Now, I mean, preface this with saying it depends on the country, on where you're at, and what the legal age of majority is. Right? There's other considerations too. If you start getting into certain societies in South Asia and certain parts of sub-Saharan Africa, if a lady is actually married already and she's only 15, in that context, she might be considered part of that age of majority, in which case no assent would be necessary. So there are circumstances that would lend themselves to different processes taking place or different processes being used. But in general, 7 to 17 is roughly the age value for assent. Now then within those two brackets, you're correct in saying we sort of assignate two different distinctions here, 7 to 11, 12 to 17. Readability scale for those, any ideas? What do you think? Readability scale. We're targeting people that are not graduate PhD students, such as yourselves here. So what's the readability scale? What do you think?
3rd grade.
You're getting closer. Yeah, 5th grade roughly is what we're shooting for here. So no big words, right? Common mistake that we have, or at least I have, you got to have the title of your study, on these assent documents. And just recently, I was putting one together, and I kept getting a readability scale of 15. And I've been writing assent forms for a long time. Like I write it the same way every time, but I forgot to take out like the title and the principal investigators' names and things. And it's a very complicated title, big words, et cetera. And so it kept coming up as graduate level writing. And I thought something was wrong with my computer. But anyway, those are some of the issues here. But you don't have to use written documentation. Other reasons why you might not use written documentation, you might think of another reason why.
Literacy.
Literacy certainly is a big one, right? They can't read. It's unethical to put a document in front of them that they cannot read and ask them to sign it. Donald?
Some people are scared of written document.
Yeah, why would they be scared?
Maybe they might think that they will be accountable for something.
Okay. Yeah, good.
The other is political reasons.
Yeah, political reasons, absolutely. Those are two good ones.
That will take down your
Yeah,
responsibility.
right. And go ahead.
You just, because of the countries, you don't actually have those resources like to print out or computers or something.
Okay, that certainly could be a reason as well. Another issue I've run into is that, you got one? Go ahead. I'm sorry? Privacy, okay. Yeah, they might be afraid of a privacy or breach of confidentiality or something to that effect.
Legal liability.
I'm sorry?
It's kind of legal liability.
Yeah, legal liability, that's another reason. One of the ones that I used to run into in studies that we've run in West Africa, in Gambia, Mali, Senegal, different areas, in some of those groups, some of those ethnicities, the only time you ever sign a piece of paper is transfer of property. And in those instances, you're not going to get these folks to actually sign off on any study. So verbal consent will work. Of course, we work with the IRB to get permission to do an alteration of the consent process. That's always going to be a requirement. This is not something we as researchers make on our own. It's not a decision we make. We work with Human Research Protection Office, Compliance Office, et cetera, and figure out a way to alter that process without violating the different principles and practices. All right? Everybody with me so far here? Now there's some other challenges getting consent. Now this is sort of international setting versus sort of the Western construct. What do you think some of these other challenges might be here? What do you think, Bert?
Language.
Language is a big one. Language is a huge one for sure. Especially if you're using a written document, right? So often, how do you get around that? You use a translator, okay. So let me try to pick an obscure language here. It's always tricky for me because I'm looking around the room. There's lots of different languages spoken here. So we could use a written document, get a translator. The problem is that sometimes words don't translate the right way into a different language. So who here speaks an obscure second language? What do you got for us? That's from Papua New Guinea?
Yeah.
Or how do you say randomization? That sounds like a lot of words.
Yeah.
So basically, what were you saying?
We're gonna pick some, but I wouldn't know how to say randomization.
Yeah?
exactly.
Is there a word mnemonic?
No.
No. Not for randomization? What about for venipuncture?
The concept.
Anybody got a venipuncture one for me? Where were you from? Zimbabwe? What do you speak? Dona?
Yeah.
Venipuncture? Venipuncture, like drawing blood from a vein.
We don't have like a way to specific.
Yeah, so you guys get the point, right? Right, so you get the point. It works with French, Spanish, German, English, things of this nature, but it doesn't work in every context, right? So oftentimes we'll have translators who either translate a written document or translate the concept, and that would be a verbal translation of the concept, right? So you've got the written document, written in English or French or whatever, and then you've got somebody translating that document for them, right? So what's another challenge? So language is a big one.
Lack of understanding. Like just because you explain something to them in a like level that they can understand doesn't mean they're actually still going to understand the concept.
So how do we know if they understand or not?
Can't.
We can't?
Yes.
I mean, you can, I guess. It's harder.
It is harder. How do we do it?
You ask them to repeat it back to you.
Okay, you could ask them to repeat it back any other way? Yeah.
They made us answer one, like they added questions on the end specifically for each part of the study. If they had any.
Right, good. That's a good way to do it too, right? So either read it, have them read it back, have them answer a few questions at the end, or like, what's the drug you're going to be taking? You tell me. How much am I going to pay you to be in this study? Have them ask these questions back to you. Any other issues?
Trust. Yeah.
Trust? How's trust work? You guys both?
We have that trust, I mean, if you were to walk into a village in Africa, not everyone's going to be like, oh yeah, that guy, he's cool. Like they don't know you. They don't put their faith in you that you have the best interest at heart.
All right, now let me just say this. I personally don't go collect the data.
I know, but like
You're talking about the team, the data collection.
the data collectors, yes.
Maybe blood data. Anything else? Just think about individuality for a second here and how we view that here versus other societies that might not have that same construct in mind.
There are some cultural differences.
Like what?
For example, in some community, if there is a woman, you want to interview a woman, first the husband has to give you permission. So, and a woman cannot be interviewed by a man.
Okay.
So you have those kind of challenges.
All right, good. So that's getting more toward. So when we start thinking about the bigger picture of how we view consent process in, let's say, the U.S. or a Western country, or versus maybe a rural or traditional or communal type environment, we've got sort of this Western construct of autonomy of the individual. We as individuals make our own decisions. That's sort of the way we view it. But in some communities, it's the community that makes the decision, right? So you might have decision-making in relation to informed consent, initial discussion with the chief, the village council, the mayor, whoever's in charge of that community. Then you might have to have subsequent discussions with the male and female elders or whatever in that community. Then discuss consent discussions with potential subjects and or their guardians. And then consent discussions with potential. Right, so there's a process that you'd have to go through here, right? So yeah, we start with the Ministry of Health. Then we've got to move to sort of the mayor or the chief or the village, whoever's in charge. Then we're going to move to sort of the head of the household, whoever that might be. Then we're going to move to the subject's guardian or caregiver. Then we're going to move to the subject. Now, is that informed consent? So the Federal Ministry of Health said, yes, we can go in and do this. The chief said, yes, absolutely, want you to do the study here in this community. Head of household said, yes, I want my family to be in the study. The mother of the child said yes, or the mother of the 18-year-old, let's say, said yes. And now the subject. We got to get the subject to consent. and the subject says yes. Is that informed consent?
Maybe.
Feel coerced.
Yeah, it could be kind of coerced.
Think that's coercion?
It could be a form because they're like, maybe they're not like being intentionally coerced, but they have like pressure on them that everyone said yes and they feel like they should say yes.
Yeah, that's our big challenge, right? That's the big challenge. Everybody above them, everybody, all their elders, all the folks they respect said yes. Let's be in the study. And now this guy or this lady's put in a position where what's she going to say or he's going to say? And everybody else said yes. So of course they're going to say yes. That's not really consent. Yeah.
That's difficult though, because some people might make their decisions in life that way.
Yeah.
If the people around them agree with that, then they're going to do that. So is that really coercion?
Well, I don't know. I mean, this is the challenge. I should have said at the beginning of the discussion, I don't actually have very many answers. These are just challenges I'm presenting to you. I have no solutions for any of these. Yeah.
Also, if that subject is 18 and therefore an adult, why don't you go from that scale and see if he wants to do it first, then get the permission from others? So
We can, in some instances, do that, but that's typically not the path. That's typically not the path. Definitely, you got to start with the Ministry of Health. And then certainly you got to go to the community leaders to see if it's going to be in there. And then maybe depending on how patriarchal that society is, maybe you could jump straight to the subject. But typically you got to follow some sort of hierarchy, which again presents that question. Is that coercion? What is that? Yeah.
I don't see this as being very different from working with children. I mean, if a parent brings a child into the research study and says, you're going to go talk to this nice man or lady or whatever it is to go do data, they're going to ask you a bunch of questions and you're going to play with some toys or whatever. It's the same conceptually. It's very similar in that, well, mom says it's okay to do, so I'm going to go ahead and do it. So it's actually kind of in this sort of parallel arguments. And we seem to have worked that one out somehow. We do a lot of research.
Yeah.
So I don't know, then is that?
Well, technically, you're not supposed to tell the child they're going to do that. You're supposed to ask the child.
Right, but
Not
mom might
three-year-old.
come in and if mom.
And in fact, mom's got to give consent too,
For
right?
sure,
Yeah.
but it's a similar sort of. Folks are kind of giving the thumbs up to a study, and then isn't that sort of synonymous to mom bringing their child in to go talk to this person?
Yeah,
It's symbolically similar.
Could be.
But like the way you phrase it, you're like, do you want to go play with this nice person? Like, had you not put that word in there, you change the whole context of it.
Well,
That's at the discretion of the parent, not the researcher.
so let's say it's
But like, that's the same thing here.
Right.
let's say it's a vaccine trial. And we're going to put my kids in a vaccine trial. Right. Am I going to ask them if they want to go in and talk to this nice lady and get 5 shots?
As a parent, I guess.
Yeah, they're probably not going to do it, right? So it's true, but you're right. I
Depends
see
on
your.
the age of the child.
I see the
Right.
parallels. I do. My 16-year-old.
Right, but if you have a
Goes all the
smaller
way to
child, they
spectrum.
have, they're like, no, I don't want.
That's true. But they do have to assent, technically.
They do, of course, technically, but
Well, not a
to
three-year-old.
the point around whether or not it's coercive, it's something similar logic.
Yeah, I don't disagree. But below the age of 5-ish, 6-ish, et cetera, they don't have to assent at all. I can tell them to go in and get that shot. You are going to be in that study, so, yeah.
But there were times when we were drawing blood, even on like a young child, and if they were they were extremely upset. I mean, the people that were actually drawing the sample would say like, look, this
Skip
kid
it,
does
yeah.
not want to do it. Like,
Yeah.
So there is kind of still a level of.
Yeah. Yeah, what do you guys do about like the randomization of that when you get like randomized study going?
We're doing the whole community, and usually even if it's crying, like you would still draw the blood. It's just if they really,
Yeah. It's tricky. You told the kid all they have to do is scream and yell. They're out.
Every kid cries.
So,
Yeah.
all right. Well, anyway, you guys get the gist, right? There's challenges. Process depending on cultural context. So, obstacles, we've hit most of them. But here's a few. Language, I think that's probably our biggest obstacle that we have to overcome. Lack of literacy, sometimes in rural populations, you might hit 80-90% illiteracy, in which case, the consent must be oral at that point, and you've got to come up with a way to make sure they understand what they're getting into. Limited experience with sort of different types of Western medical practices. They're unaware of what venipunctures might be, or finger sticks, or other procedures that we might take for granted. This is also a big one, multiple institutional review boards. Often, multiple institutional. So if we're doing an international study and we've got a partner in country, we've got to get IRB permission from Tulane, IRB permission from often the funder, our in-country partner, and the country themselves. And they've all got to agree on the different process that's going to take place, mostly for the consent. Mostly for the consent. We're getting a lot better with this, though. Over the years, we've sort of worked it out where we all might be working off the same protocol, but we're only using our individual institutional IRBs for the activities that these employees are undertaking, right? So that's where we're getting better at sort of breaking up the differences. So, for example, if Tulane is involved in a study and all we're doing, drafting protocols, providing technical assistance, we might not need IRB permission from the in-country partner or the in-country federal Ministry of Health. We're not conducting the study. We're just providing assistance around analysis or drafting protocols or something of that nature. So we're getting better at sort of differentiating tasks, and that's simplifying this process for sure. And certainly there's potential misunderstandings of different documents and what you're trying to explain. And then, of course, the documentation we discussed, often associated with transfer of property or mistrust in general. So these aren't all the obstacles. These are just a handful that we've experienced over the years. We're all good with this? Everybody get how confusing and messy, floppy this process is? All right, good. So let's take a look at a scenario here real quick. And we've already discussed most of these points, so this should be pretty easy. So you're conducting a study in rural Pakistan. This is a study that we actually did related to adolescent reproductive health. And we're targeting women ages 15 to 19. Household surveys are going to be used. So we're going to go to the household, randomly selected households, and interview them. We're going to ask them questions, right? Country's predominantly patriarchal, strong traditional values and customs, and a very rural area that we are operating in. So here's the questions for you. Who do we get consent from? $30 seconds.
You have to go through that hierarchy, community, elders.
Yeah, definitely. We're going to go through the hierarchy here.
Like a dad.
Yeah, the dad.
Dad
Or husband.
or husband.
Or husband.
And what if she's married? Do we need any consideration with that?
You need to talk to somebody from that community because you need to clarify, because some people might be offended if you go and try to, maybe not in this community, but you need to really clarify if you try to go ask her husband for consent for something.
That's true. Now, let me just, in my defense, we don't actually do this in a void. We do actually go in ahead of time and chit chat with lots of people about whether this is even feasible, what we're going to do in this study. And that's one level of permission that we're actually getting. So we do actually absolutely do that. But in general, so let's say we've got permission to be in the study and she's married, who else needs to consent? The husband's going to consent, right? The husband's going to consent as well. Husband says no. Woman going to participate? Probably not. Probably not. So what if she's not married and the father's not home?
Uncle?
Wait for the father. Yeah.
They might wait for the father, or maybe another male elder or a brother could also consent in this particular context that we're talking in this particular study. Right? So lots of different ways here. So how do we ensure the privacy of the respondent? We're talking about reproductive health. So presumably we're talking about sexual activity, a whole spectrum of sensitive information. How do you ensure the privacy here?
You assign patient ID numbers, so it's not like linked to their name.
Well, definitely. We don't even need their names. That's a great one for sure. We'll give them a unique ID. We could not care less about the name. So yes, definitely that's one way to ensure privacy. De-link that data immediately. What's another way? Yeah, what do you think?
Not somebody around when you interview.
I'm sorry?
When you do actually the interview,
Uh-huh.
you should be in an area in which there are no other persons.
Okay. All right. Definitely we try to do that. You add something?
Along those lines, I mean, I think some cultural elements where they wouldn't allow a young female adolescent woman to be interviewed without a parent or even another older female, someone else in the room.
Yeah, we ran into that. We ran into that a lot. Yeah, in this particular study, that was a big deal. So how do you ensure the privacy here? Or what do you do? I mean, obviously, you're not ensuring privacy here. I mean, are you going to get good data if you've got somebody else sitting in that room? No, if I ask you, your husband's sitting there because he's insisting on being part of the process, and I ask you how many sex partners you've had, what's the answer? One. The answer's one, right? Right. So there's no validity here at all to the data. The answer is going to be one all the way across the 1,000-person sample. The answer is one. Right. So having someone in the room definitely compromises things. So what do you do about that? I'm sorry?
Switch to a survey instead of an interview.
What do you mean switch to a survey? What do you mean?
As opposed to sitting in an interview scenario or asking questions, I would switch my methodology so I don't have to interview participants, but I could ask them to fill out a survey.
Oh, ask them to fill out the survey form instead of me filling out the survey.
Right.
Okay, I got you.
Assuming that there aren't challenges around
Literacy or something like that. Yeah, okay, that's a good, that's an idea for sure. And what if the husband or mother wants to see the answers?
I guess your study is pretty.
I'll tell you what we do.
Rephrase the question.
Maybe another way to ask this question is just to externalize the scenario. How about your friends or someone else in the village? How many partners do they have? That way you can have the picture of the community, right? It's a matter of shifting from quantitative to qualitative study.
Well, I hear what you're saying in terms of solving that particular problem, but that's not what we're trying to get at in the research. So anybody else got any ideas what you do about this?
You can use an iPad where they answer one question at a time. Once the answer disappears, and you can't see that again.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, that's good.
But then you like struggle with like, what if they don't understand the technology?
Yeah.
Like you know what I mean? Like to us, like an iPad, like is so standard, but like some of these places don't even own a computer. Like
Play a little game in the beginning.
Yeah. Well, what were you saying?
My response could be situation dependent, but maybe administer a survey to the other person in the room as well at the same time. Somehow distract them. Maybe they step right in.
Okay.
Have two interviewers and-
Yeah, maybe that might work. Well, so the way we deal with it in this particular study, the way we dealt with it was if someone insisted on sitting in the room, we went through the least sensitive questions that we had and then just tossed the data. Just get rid of it. We're not going to ostracize them or make them feel bad or make them feel like they didn't do their part or somehow answered something incorrectly. We didn't ask sensitive questions. We just went through sort of the easy ones and then just tossed the data record. We're not going to use that subject. Yeah.
This is a question sort of outside of the issue around ethics, but in doing that, don't you end up with a terribly biased sample? Because then you've got data that is only collected from participants who were able to get in context where they could be individually interviewed alone without a parent guardian.
Yeah, that's a challenge for all surveys in general, selection bias. But one of the ways we deal with that is we inflate our sample size. And so it's sort of, in essence, they're dropping out of the study, but we have a replacement for them. But yeah, that's a risk that you certainly run, is selection bias when everybody's dropping out because they can't give us valid responses for sure. This was a tricky study to do. It really was. So what do you do if a subject accepts to participate but will not sign a consent form? And the protocol requires them to sign the form. What do you do then?
They don't participate.
Not in, right? Yeah, they're out. They're out. They're out of the study. Yeah. If the protocol requires them to sign a document, and that's what the IRBs have approved, communities have approved, and they won't sign it, but they're willing to be in the study, they're out. Yeah, that's pretty easy. Okay. All right, so let's do another one here. All right, so let's talk about compensation. Can you get paid to be in a study?
Yeah.
How much?
Depends on the study.
Yeah.
Depends on the study. Any ideas?
I mean, like I know some drug studies will pay you thousands of dollars.
Yeah.
Which
Typically.
study? Thousands of dollars?
I mean, like I know someone who participated in a study. It was like he had to spend 3 months in some paid like grand.
For 3 months?
Yeah. I'm not saying it's a lucrative idea, but like,
Well, what's the face when we're dealing with
Coercion.
it's coercion, right? It's coercion. So for those couple that have had the malaria class, you've seen this picture before, right? These are folks out collecting infectious mosquitoes, right? So infectious mosquito lands on this guy's leg, it's got malaria parasites in it, going to contract malaria, no doubt, depending on how fast this guy can suck that mosquito off his leg, right? So who would participate in this study with me? Anybody?
Yeah,
I'll
sure.
pay you
Absolutely.
$10. $10?
Yeah.
For $10,
You
you
take
do
the
it?
mosquitoes off of me.
10 American dollars or 10?
I'll give you 10 American.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But if I didn't have you out there sitting there in the first place, I wouldn't have any. You could be sitting in a screened house watching TV, right? So $10, any takers?
Yeah.
$100? You're easy. I'm gonna get in touch with you next time we got a study and you're in. $100 for this? It could kill you. This is a disease that could kill you. Yeah.
Actually, well, I enrolled in a malaria study, so 1,000.
2,000? You'll do it for $2,000. Who's in for $2,000?
Maybe.
This is rural Kenya, right? Rural Kenya. And I got $2,000 so far. I'm going to get every one of you to consent here to get on board. $10,000. Who's in for $10,000? I only need you for about an hour.
But death.
$10,000? You're in for $10,000? Yeah. So, all right.
That's also
Rural
really
Kenya.
horrible.
What's the average wage in rural Kenya? Any ideas?
Couple dollars.
$2,000 a year, probably, something like that. I'm paying you $10,000 for an hour. That's coercion, right? What I can pay you for is your time, your parking, maybe your lunch, transportation, things of this nature. Generally, that comes, and if we take the U.S. context as an example, that comes in the form of, you know, if I need you for an hour, it's probably going to be $30, $40 or something like that you're going to get, somewhere in that neighborhood. Whoever your friend is that was locked in a room for 3 months, $4,000, that's not coercion, that's a bad deal. That's what that is. But we'll
I
leave
didn't
it.
say you was smart.
Yeah, so maybe that was the study. But so the answer is yes, you can pay people to be in the study, but you have to pay them based on time lost, wages lost, transportation costs, things that are reasonable that you wouldn't expect them to go out of pocket for. But it can't be enough where they're like, hey, you know what, I got to feed my family, and so I need to take this $500 or whatever just to make sure they get fed. Right? Now, to conclude with this picture, these are actually employees that we were working with. I'm using the picture as an example here, right? They're paid regularly, you know, salaried people, et cetera. And they probably have acquired immunity to malaria, but if they didn't, we certainly treated them for malaria anyway at the end of their shift, just in case you were wondering. So, okay, so that's compensation. Yeah. So here's another good scenario. Heard of this before. So this gets at payment issues as well. So Henrietta Lacks. Anybody familiar with this study or this story rather? Okay. Scientists know her as Gila, poor black tobacco farmer whose cells were taken without her knowledge in 1951. Became one of the most important tools in medicine, vital for developing vaccines, cloning, gene mapping, in vitro fertilization, etc. Henrietta's cells have been bought and sold by billions, yet nobody knows who she is, and her family can't even afford health insurance. Henrietta Lacks never gave consent for her tissue samples to be used in research. Family didn't either, and nobody's been compensated to date. So questions. Who controls this tissue and substances that make up humans?
Just the individual looking at.
But she's dead.
The family.
Yeah.
Her family?
So play with
Why haven't we paid her yet? Her family.
Yeah, like
They probably can't afford to stay over.
bureaucracy.
That leads into question two. Who should be compensated and how much is appropriate? Well, I imagine the family's quite large by now. I mean, yeah, this is 60, 70 years ago.
Direct descendants should become.
Direct descendants?
Or like
direct, like parents, like I doubt her parents are still alive,
Mhm.
you know, but like children,
Her
grandchildren.
children?
Yeah.
Okay.
But like I wouldn't say like her second cousin from the marriage, you know, like they don't necessarily need to be compensated.
They're part of the tissue cell bank too. Their DNA is in there.
But comparatively, the children have more right to it.
Anybody else? What do you think?
Well, I mean, the issue around compensation, I'm not sure if compensation is the right terminology in this scenario. It's more around reparation for wrongs that were done. I mean, her tissue was taken without her consent while she was living, so she should have consented.
Mm-hmm.
And so the issue isn't about who's compensated for what should have been compensated. It's about reparations for a wrong that was.
That's a separate issue though, but I agree with you. Reparations is a separate issue, but they're still using it.
Yeah.
So now let's move into compensation. They're still using these cells, this DNA. You're right, reparations, I imagine there is some sort of case going on. I would imagine that is happening somewhere.
Are her children still alive?
Yeah.
Yeah.
She has
It was
I
Friday.
thought,
I mean,
they
you
had-
could-
I thought they had
I
done
thought they had
stuff.
actually done stuff in the past, like descendants' families, and
Uh-huh.
then they're getting a percentage or something.
There's like a whole
Yeah, I
book.
was gonna say,
I
like,
agree. Yeah.
arguably you could give
Oh.
her kids a certain percent and then.
Oh, I think
They're
it
still
is
trying to
like
figure this out?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's still.
That's what I thought too.
Yeah.
Because there are two issues. There's the reparation issue. What do we
Yeah.
owe you for what we did wrong?
Yeah.
And then who owes who, right? Because we're talking about dozens of vaccine companies and other biomedical companies that have gotten involved in this research. Talking about, if not hundreds, dozens at least. So there's reparation issue of what do we owe you for what we did wrong versus what do we compensate you moving forward to continue using this very important line of DNA. Right? So, and again, I don't have any answers.
Can't you argue, weren't they, I'm sorry, weren't they cancer cells?
Yeah.
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 So
they're
couldn't you
cancer
argue, I'm gonna play devil, couldn't you argue that it wasn't technically her DNA because it's mutated and it wasn't?
Well, it still was her
Still
DNA.
was, but like at this point, has it continued to mutate and is it even the same that it, when it
You're
was?
saying like on the cell line?
Yeah.
cells. What was your question?
I'm just wondering what the standard practice was in 1951 and if that is applicable to, we're using it now. And I'm also trying to play devil's advocate.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
do think, she should have been compensated. But if the standard practice in 1951 was just to take people's tissue and use it for whatever you wanted, does that play a role?
When the
I
federal
don't
county will
think
come into play.
After, so the origins trace back to the National Research Act of, I think, 1974.
Late in the game, 1974.
Yeah, and I think there were also racial stuff with
Well,
her
yeah.
case too,
Well, of
right?
course,
Because she
yeah,
was also
absolutely.
like a poor
Yeah.
black woman.
Yeah,
I was just gonna agree with her, like they were taking advantage of that person because, she wasn't white.
yeah, right.
Could you treat this potentially almost like a copyright issue where like she should own that, but now she's dead, and so like her children would
I think
now
that's
have
what
the
they are
copyright
trying to
Yeah, I
do.
think
and
that
get
is
a
what
certain
they're trying
percentage
to
from
do.
I think
anyone.
that
who's
is the
using it.
argument, again, but discussion that they're having, like the percent, right? What's the right percent and who has to pay?
Mhm.
Because we're talking about companies that bought this from companies that bought it from companies, none of which extracted the tissue or extracted the DNA or had anything to do with the 1951 event. None of them. So none of them are going to pay. And they will come to a settlement, I'm sure, at some point, just because that'll be cheaper, not because it's the right thing to do. It'd be cheaper. But anyway, another conundrum for us to contemplate here. So in the interest of time, we'll keep moving on here. Risks and benefits. How do we decide whether or not the risk-benefit ratio is appropriate? That's another challenge for us. And again, it's context and culturally context specific. Right here, what we've got going on is vaccine studies going on in Ouagadougou, in the capital of Burkina Faso. What do you guys think? How do you figure out whether or not the risk outweighs the benefit or the benefit outweighs the risk? What do you think?
Number of people suffering or number of people who might die.
Okay, good. That's definitely something we considered. What's our recent example where we rolled out vaccine trials very fast? The Ebola outbreak, right? We did not go through phase 1, 2, 3, 4 trials with the Ebola vaccine that rolled out. It rolled out. And that's a function of, hey, people are dying by the thousands every day. the risk of the vaccine killing you outweighs the benefit of going through the proper channels.
I think it depends on like the severity of the disease too.
Severity of the disease, absolutely, right? You've got, what's the word, compassionate,
Use.
compassionate use, right? Yeah, expanded access, that's another way, right? So if this person's dying imminently or will die if they don't receive some drug that's not FDA approved for use in that particular case, that's another way, another criteria you can certainly use. Depends on the disease. That's right, it certainly does. But there's no easy answer here for this as well. Definitely in the U.S. context, we have the FDA that regulates much of the drug use and how it's used, where it's used, and whom it's used on. In international settings, different countries have their own equivalent of the FDA, or many do. Some more rigorous than others, et cetera. Anyway, lots of issues to consider with the risks and benefits, and there's no answer here for this either. All right, scientific and social value, that's the other thing we have to consider. How much good is this particular study going to do versus the value of the study? So what we're looking at here was an evaluation we did in Eritrea, the indoor residual spray with DDT, right? So we're going into houses, spraying them up and down the walls with DDT to kill mosquitoes to try to reduce malaria parasite prevalence. What do you think? There's scientific value in this, social value in this? You guys are familiar with DDT? You guys are all on board with this? We're an easy group, man. The malaria people are shaking their heads. Yes, I see this, but that's because they were heard this story before. You guys are on board with use of DDT?
No, I think it's different. Like, I think if you're an American, like a group of researchers and DDT usage isn't allowed here, then.
What do you see on the side of that can?
USA. Yeah, no, and I definitely know that the US sells a lot of DDT to other countries. But I think when you're thinking of malaria too, there may be like education, like there's a lot of other ways to like educate about malaria, I guess.
Yeah, that's true.
But I also see I guess I'm just thinking of the ways that it's not, that it wouldn't fully convince me to just go out.
So how do we decide whether or not this is worth it?
Seems like a short-term fix.
DDT's got a residual efficacy of about a year. 6 months to a year.
Environmental
That is
impact,
short term, I guess.
too,
In
is
the grand
another.
scheme. What's that?
Environmental impact also.
That's what I mean. Like, it's like a short-term fix for the malaria, but then environmentally, like, is that going to cause a problem in their environment that later is going to cause them other problems besides? Like, now they don't have malaria as a problem, but they have other issues.
But if they have imminent death, like,
Yeah, that's true.
That's true.
Malaria is not imminent death by any means. It can kill you.
Yeah.
In the absence of immunity.
Aren't there different areas that are like more highly affected than others? In which case, maybe you would use the DDT versus like.
So, all right, Eritrea, just to give you a little bit more information, got about a 1 to 3% prevalence of malaria. That's pretty low.
Yeah. So probably not.
I'm from an India.
Yeah.
Any thoughts here?
I'd probably pass on the DDT.
You're gonna allow it in your house? Knock on the door, dressed like that.
But did they take other measures first that proved not
That's
to
what
work?
I was, yeah, like
What's
with
that?
net education.
Yeah, did
things
they
like
like
that.
try nets? Did they try other things that like failed?
No, well, so the question in this study was, what's the added benefit of using indoor residual spray over and above net use, case management, et cetera? Yeah, what's the added benefit? Yeah, what do you think?
So this is related to the issue of informed consent. If you are properly informing folks on the risk, I mean, I'm a social scientist, so I have no idea what we're talking about in the context of this particular thing that you're spraying. But if hypothetically you give proper information and people are properly informed and they're giving their consent, then they would recruit it if they understand the risks and benefits appropriately. Whether or not the IRB would approve that, I think is kind of an issue.
Yeah.
And that maybe depends more on, well, are we doing it in this particular location? You get approval for a location in the US, then you probably have some technical issues.
Sure.
But
Well, we don't have malaria in the U.S. anymore, thankfully.
thankfully, but I mean, you know what I'm saying, in some kind of, in another context. I guess.
So let me throw a little wrench into that for you here. Anna, you want to provide some context about Eritrea?
Yeah.
Do you think that, can Eritreans in a study like this truly be informed consent? Is it relevant?
In the context of, transmission, even if it is just 3%, but it's seasonal, so people don't have immunity. So you might have lots of days, even if the percentage seems small.
Yeah.
But it can kill really people.
All right, now let's look at it this way though. Let's say the government of Eritrea is coming to your house.
You can say no.
You cannot say no. Yeah, not in Eritrea. So I hear what you're saying, but in this context, consent's not even possible. The only way your house is not getting sprayed is if you're not home. They might spray it anyway. But you not being home is your best chance of not getting sprayed. But the house, not you personally. Although we used to spray our soldiers, for World War II with DDT. Yeah.
Isn't it also an issue like doing like an ethical problem when you're doing these studies in like third world countries where it's kind of more of they're more desperate. So in a country where they have malaria, they're going to be desperate to like fix that problem versus like in the US, like we wouldn't let people in our houses to spray that, but it's also because we don't have this problem.
Yeah, like I was just thinking about my dad. I'm originally from India, and in my area of India, there's high prevalence of malaria, and he's so on board with DDT. Like he wants the Indian government to have more DDT. He wants to eradicate mosquitoes because he's a doctor too, and he's seen so many patients die.
Yeah.
So I guess it does come to like the dire consequence or the dire situation.
I get what you're saying. My only issue. For those that have children, that's the issue, right? We can probably all refrain from licking the walls. Kids cannot. Kids are going to lick walls, right? That's what they do. They touch walls, they put their fingers in their mouth, they lick walls. That's the real issue, is what are the genetic implications down the road. And they are doing studies on that right now in South Africa to see what are the genetic implications down the road, next generation, et cetera. Only a few countries have been approved to use DDT. And it's only to target medically important arthropods, just to put your minds at ease. They're not going to approve it in the United States to kill cockroaches or something like that, right? Has to be medically important arthropods. Anyway, my point is, scientific has to, the social value and scientific value, certainly very tricky topics to try and weigh out and get agreement on. How are we doing on time? 8 minutes. All right, so here's a good one for you as well. This sort of gets at scientific versus social value. You're conducting a study in DRC related to HIV infection. This is our last scenario anyway, so we'll get through. Health facility data are going to be used. That's where we're going to get our data. We're targeting women ages 15 to 49. This area of the country distrusts outsiders, believes that HIV is largely related to prostitution and promiscuity, and is thus heavily stigmatized. That's the scenario here. All right? So here's our questions. Do we need to obtain consent from a patient to test them for HIV?
Yeah.
Everybody saying yes?
Yeah.
Anybody want to say no?
I mean, if you've already taken the blood away from them.
Well, the consent form
But they
needs
like-
to contain, we may test for other illnesses.
Do we even
as
have to
well.
ask that?
Yeah.
We do?
I don't think
I
we have
thought
to
you
ask.
did.
Because if you ask them for the blood, you can test it.
Yeah, that's.
You don't have to-
They've like willingly
No,
given
you
it
have
to
say what
you.
You're going to be testing the blood for.
Once you agree to I just know this because I worked. You agree to let your blood be drawn, they can test it for other things
It's
if
the
they feel that
hospital
they
choice.
need to.
Wait, they're a patient or this is a research participant?
This is like a research, but they're in a health facility.
So like once that
No,
Oh,
one
yeah.
physician can make the decision to test that patient for HIV, but if you're using that blood for research purposes, that needs to be in the consent form.
But you're just testing to see if they have it. You're not doing research. Testing to see if they have HIV.
Well, if you're their doctor and you want to know whether they have HIV.
it's the moral
What if it's-
it's the moral
Yeah,
thing
I'm
to
saying-
tell them.
Right.
No,
You
I
can
think
do
you
it.
have
I don't think you have
to.
to.
Or you have to look at their medical records. I'm like, well, you're right. What's the answer?
I'm not going to get in the middle of this.
I think a lot of the people wouldn't even want to know, honestly. Like, the stigma.
All right, so let's hold that.
I don't know.
It's definitely related to number 2. let's say we do test them and we don't get their consent to test them. Do we have to give them the results if they did not request to be tested?
No.
Let's say they test positive. We got to tell them?
It's ethical to tell them, but you're not.
Is it ethical to tell them?
I don't know. Their life might be worse.
It's avoidable.
Isn't it more like if there's not treatments though?
Yeah, there's likely, it's not readily available. I mean, there is treatment, obviously, we have antivirals, but.
Yeah, but if it's not
Yeah,
readily
access
available.
to it,
Rural
yeah.
community, probably not readily available. Not a health insurance issue, there is none.
Would it be worse for them to know than to not know?
That's what
Like,
I.
would it make their life worse?
This right here. You believe that HIV is largely related to prostitution and promiscuity. You tell the lady she's HIV positive, gets to question number 3, how do you
She might be
ensure privacy,
ostracized, yeah.
right? What's gonna happen to this lady?
Yeah, but do you risk infecting the entire community with HIV?
But that's like such a Western way to look at
Yeah.
it, like Western viewpoint. Because to them, it's worse to be kicked out of the
Yeah.
community than have HIV.
Yeah, what do you
I
think?
know in PNA, it's still pretty stigmatized and like in some rural communities, like people will get help.
Yeah, yeah.
So I don't think.
So
I
what
think
do
if
we
you're
think?
not getting consent to test for HIV, you don't have to tell.
Oh, I think you can't, for sure.
All right, now, let me just set the time right here. We've got 2 minutes or so, so in the interest of
This
time,
isn't the US.
let me tell you what the official stance is on this. And I'm sure some of you have heard of this. Well, unlinked anonymous testing. It's WHO practice to do this. You take discarded blood from a patient, usually they're testing them for STDs or a pregnancy test or a rapid diagnostic test for malaria. They take the remaining cartridge blood, no name, no unique ID, nothing attached to it. It's pooled into the other batch of unlinked anonymous samples, and they test it. There is no way to give individual results. There's no way to do it. This is considered one of the better ways to get prevalence information for HIV. And that's the way they do it in DRC. I just picked DRC because it's the country we were working in at the time. Lots of countries do it this way. She's very upset. You're very upset. This is WHO practice. It's called unlinked anonymous testing. Is allowed without consent. Right? But again, as somebody was saying, I can't remember who, it's not for research purposes. This is for programmatic purposes. This is to test or this is to measure prevalence of HIV, right? And this is just the only reason they're using 15 to 49-year-olds is because that's reproductive age. They tend to come into antenatal care facilities more often than men would, and so their blood is readily available. It's not a representative sample by any means. It's not population-based, but it's the best estimate. Who's going into international research? Yeah, all right, good. Well, that's all I've got. I don't know if you guys got any questions for me. I'm welcome to answer them. If not,
Any questions, anyone? Or welcome. Stick around if you have questions. Dr. Keating. All right, same place and time next week, and remember the time will shoot. Thank you.